everybody! It's time for chapter 14, Marvellous Medicine number 4. Back in the kitchen once again, George, with Mr. Cranky watching him anxiously, tipped half a pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant saucepan. "Boil it up again," cried Mr. Cranky. "Boil it and stir it." George boiled it and stirred it. "You'll never get it right," said Mrs. Cranky. "Don't forget, you don't just have to have the same things, but you've got to have exactly the same amounts of those things. And how can you possibly do that?" "You keep out of this," cried Mr. Cranky. "We're doing fine. We've got it this time. You'll see if we haven't." This was George's Marvellous Medicine number 4. And when it had boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cupful of it out into the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him. Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. "You're going to have some mighty queer chickens around here if you go on like this," she said. "Dish it out, George," cried Mr. Cranky. "Give a spoonful to that one over there." He pointed to a brown hen. George knelt down and held out the spoon with the new medicine in it. "Chick, chick," he said, "try some of this." The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon, and then it went, peck. "Ouchie!" it said, and then a funny whistling noise came out of its beak. "Watch it grow!" shouted Mr. Cranky. "Don't be too sure," Mrs. Cranky said. "Why is it whistling like that?" "Keep quiet, woman," cried Mr. Cranky. "Give it a chance." They stood there staring at the brown hen. "It's getting smaller," George said. "Look at it, Dad, it's shrinking." And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much it was no bigger than a new hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. And now our final chapter, Goodbye Grandma. "There's still something you've left out," Mr. Cranky said. "I can't think what it could be," George said. "Give it up," Mrs. Cranky said. "Just pack it in, you'll never get it right." Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in one hand and the cup of brown medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the 3 people below her and shouted, "What's going on down there?" she said. "Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with rats and mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and no bacon, no buttered toast." "I'm sorry, Mother," Mrs. Cranky said. "We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away." "Let George get it, the lazy little brute," Grandma shouted. Just then the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of a brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. "Ha!" she cried. "Ha! So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? Make sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you don't think to bring one to your poor old Grandma. Always knew you were a selfish little pig." "No, Grandma," George said. "This isn't—" "Don't lie to me, boy," the enormous old hag shouted. "Pass it up here this minute." "No," cried Mrs. Cranky. "No, Mother, don't. It's not for you." "Now you're against me too," shouted Grandma. "My own daughter trying to stop me from having a breakfast, trying to starve me out." Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and smiled sweetly. "Of course it's for you, Grandma," he said. "You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot." "Don't think I won't," Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out her huge horny hand for the cup. "Hand it over, George." "No, no, Grandma," George cried out, pulling the cup away. "You mustn't, you're not to have it." "Give it to me, boy," yelled Grandma. "Don't," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's George's Marvellous—" "Everything's George's round here," shouted Grandma. "George this, George that. I'm fed up with it." She snatched the cup out of George's hand and carried it high up out of reach. "Drink it up, Grandma," Mr. Cranky said with a huge grin. "Lovely tea." "No!" the other two cried. "No!" But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed down everything that was in it. "Mother!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "You've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous No. 4 medicine, and look what tiny spoonful did to that little brown hen." But Grandma didn't even hear. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. "This is going to be interesting," Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. "Now you've done it!" cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. "You've cooked the old girl's goose." "I didn't do anything," Mr. Cranky said. "Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it." A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. "She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam," Mr. Cranky said. "She's gonna blow up!" Mrs. Cranky cried. "Her boiler's going to burst!" "Stand clear," Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and whistling was so high and shrill that it hurt his ears. "Call the fire brigade!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police! Man the hose pipes!" "Too late," said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. "Grandma!" shrieked Mrs. Cranky. "Mother! Run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. "Watch this, George!" Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. "Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of one!" Very soon Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's just right now." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got, down and down she went. In another half a minute she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it always had. Her eyes, now no bigger than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. "How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget?" "She's still going," shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. "She's getting smaller." And by golly she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mr. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and she cried, "How do I stop her getting smaller still?" "You can't," cried Mr. Cranky. "She's had 50 times the right amount." "But I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch hold of each end and pull," Mr. Cranky said. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and she was still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin. Then a pumpkin seed. Then... "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her!" "Hooray!" shouted Mrs. Cranky. "She's gone! She's disappeared completely!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's what happens to you if you're a grumpy and bad-tempered old woman," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, "Oh, well, I suppose it's for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she?" "Yes," Mr. Cranky said, "she most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning, and for a few brief moments he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of the magic world. That's the end of George's Marvellous Medicine. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for listening. Night night.